Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Ollie Runswick from King's College London, discussing his research on anticipation, how and when to add context to practice, and the use of video feedback in sports training. So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I had a great discussion with Ollie Runswick about a variety of topics related to motor control, skill acquisition, and practice design. I think his work is an excellent mix of basic theoretical and applied work with some important implications for how we're instructing new learners and how we use technology in training. Hope you enjoy. So today I'm joined by Ollie Runswick from King's College London. Thanks for taking some time to join me, Ollie.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
So to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into sports science and performance psychology, I think is your official title right now, but how you got into those things?
Yeah, I'd always been interested in coaching, actually. I started coaching when I was really quite young, and I took a gap year after I left school, and I worked in a school as like a cricket coach and doing a bit of PE, stuff like that. Couldn't really decide what to do. And then I went off and studied sports science at Swansea University in South Wales. Mm-hmm. And throughout that, I got really interested in psychology, coaching science, motor learning, and in biomechanics. And then I couldn't really work out where to go after that. But then I found the human movement science masters at the Free University of Amsterdam, which was really flexible and you could pick and choose the kind of things you did. So I went over there and did their human movement science course, which was really interesting. Lots of really great staff over there. And did some research with Dave Mann as my research project and got really into kind of perceptual motor control. The research project we did was on laterality and eye dominance in cricket batting. Mm-hmm. And that was really where I got really into skill acquisition more broadly. And then moved back to the UK and did a PhD with Jamie North, Andre Rocker and Mark Williams, more around anticipation back in London. And yeah, really, really enjoyed doing research and really enjoyed skill acquisition broadly. But I have a really broad range of interests around psychology. So while I was doing that, I started teaching psychology and neuroscience in the evenings at Imperial College for a little side thing. Then I went to the University of Chichester and became a lecturer in skill acquisition. And then about 3 years there. And now I've moved back into a psychology department at King's College, where I teach psychology students and sports students. So kind of all over the place, really.
Yeah, that's really cool. That reminds me a bit of me. Like I was the same. I couldn't decide. I liked that all, the kind of more sciencey side, the more, the movement science. The cool thing about movement science, you're right, in skill acquisition is you don't really have to choose, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's all of them, right? You could do biology, neuroscience side, whatever you want, So I like that aspect of it too. So were you a cricket player? When you were going?
I still play a bit. Cricket is probably my main sport, but never specialised. I still play golf for fun, and I used to play rugby and football and basketball as well. So, but cricket was my primary sport, and I still play a little bit too, and still involved in cricket.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I've tried to play it a couple of times. It's a bit of a baseball to cricket is a bit of a transition.
The ball bouncing.
It throws you off a bit. So you mentioned, one of the big areas that you've done work in is anticipation. You've kind of looked at it from a lot of different really interesting angles. So can you tell, I know one of the things you've kind of built on, the temporal occlusion kind of paradigm. and added things like, context and things. So can you maybe just a little bit about how the main kind of overall way you study anticipation in your research?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm someone who's wedded to one particular approach. Listening to a lot of things that have been talked about recently, I fully agree with the idea of, this is the thing I'm going to test and I'm going to test it as much as I can. But I've never really got to a point where I've decided the way that I'm going to approach things and the one that, is going to be a real buy-in for me. But the approach that I used during my PhD was a really using like temporal occlusion approach and looking at information use, not necessarily at the motor control aspect, but more at the cognitive aspect. And I think, interestingly, a lot of the stuff that I was looking at stuff that happens potentially quite a long time before the ball comes down, for example, which is something that I've always found quite an interesting discussion point as well with using kind of temporal occlusion approaches. I'm using it because I'm interested in what's happening beforehand a lot of the time. So my PhD, we looked at, to start with, a bit around anxiety and cognitive load and perceptual motor control in a kind of like in situ task. And then I took a step back to focus on the context side of things a bit more in some more controlled temporal occlusion type tasks to look at the information that's available. In cricket, it's quite a common thing in the actual game and in coaching to think about the field settings, what the bowler's done before. The score of the game can be really important too. Pretty much any player in the world could tell you if you're opening the batting, you're the first person in a certain type of game, the ball is almost always going to go to the same place.
Okay.
So that side of thing in terms of in cricket as well is really, really common. And actually they started miking up players in some of the leagues around the world, including batters. And they'd be talking people through saying, he's bowled the last ball short, so this one's going to be full. And this is before anyone's even moved or the bowler's run towards the batter or anything. And then the ball would come down full, batsman hits it out of the ground. And then he's like, well, I think he's probably going to do this next based on what's happened in the sequence of play. And listening to those things, it just kind of at a similar time that Dave Mann and Reuven Canal-Bruland wrote a paper around the need to think a bit more about situational probabilities, kind of knitted it all up for me and was something I got really interested in.
Yeah, that's really good. So you're in your studies, what the players are essentially judging is the length of the ball, right? So the length, I think, right, if I understand correct, you can roughly lack length onto speed in baseball, kind of like whether it's going to be a fast pitch or a off-speed pitch. In cricket, the equivalent is a long, which you have to play very, very differently than a short ball, right?
Yeah, correct. But also they wouldn't really match up with speed. So you could bowl a different length at different speeds as well.
Right.
And also with different swing, which would be like a curveball, baseball. So the judging the length is seen by the coaches as being the vital part to batting in cricket, because you have to either take a step forward or a step back to play the ball. And if you don't take a step, you can end up in a kind of horrible middle ground, which is less consistent in your striking in a nutshell. So you want to hit it as soon as possible after it's bounced, or as long as possible after it's bounced.
Right.
Because the bounce is unpredictable. There's a seam on the ball and the ball can move off the pitch.
Right.
So in order to account for that, you want to play it really close to the bounce or really far back. So you either have time to adjust if it moves off the pitch, or you don't let it move off the pitch because you smother it in a nutshell.
Right.
So that length bit's really, really important, regardless of the kind of bowler you have, whether it's a fast bowler or a spin bowler who would bowl maybe 50 miles an hour. Don't know what that would be in kilometers. And then a fast bowler who would be maybe 90 miles an hour, but they would bowl similar lengths maybe. Which is one of the interesting things as well. But yeah, anticipating length and line to some extent, but length is probably the most important thing.
Okay. So the batters doing a verbal judgment of long, short in
most of my studies, they are basically responding on a scaled diagram of where they think the ball would have passed the stumps. So not verbal responses. The first study of my PhD, we actually did in situ with a real bowler and looked more at the kind of shot execution part of things, with and without context, and also with and without anxiety. And then in the temporal occlusion approaches I used, they always responded with an action in some of them. So they'd have a life-size bowler running in on a kind of semi-virtual environment, but with a life-size screen, and they'd play a shot, and then they'd mark on a scale diagram where they played the shot in a nutshell.
Okay. So that's
and then in some of them, we didn't have the full kind of virtual environment, but they always marked on a scale diagram where they think the ball was going to go in space in a nutshell.
Okay. And you mentioned, so obviously you're using video or institute, with occlusion, you have some advanced cues depending on how long the display is, right? And then context, I think you mentioned the sequence of previous, like, is that the like sequence of 2 or 3 previous balls?
Yeah.
Or,
So most of my work, I would include what would be called an over in cricket, which is 6 deliveries. So one bowler can only bowl 6 times in a row, and then you change ends, and then the other bowler bowls 6 in a row. So in a kind of no context condition, I'd have no sequence, but also no game scores and no field settings, which is a common way of practicing, same as in baseball, in a net, without any kind of and often there'd be a queue of bowlers and everyone bowls one each, which is obviously very different to what the game looks like. So we'd have, for a context manipulation, we'd have the sequence, which can be quite important, but we'd have the field setting and also the score of the game, which has a big impact on the lengths people bowl as well.
Okay. Yeah. So roughly matching on to the count in baseball, I think.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. The more likely you're going to get a fastball and stuff. So you do, you combine these two things, and I know you've looked at like skill level differences. So what kind of, I know, so I like the classic Abernathy findings, skilled athletes are better with shorter, earlier occlusion periods, but what happens when you add the context on that as well with kind of skill level?
Yeah, so I found generally people of any skill level try and make sense of the information, especially in the cricket setting, on where the fielders are, where the opposition players are standing, in a nutshell, because it's quite easy to use information. If there's lots of people there and you have the understanding that they're trying to get you to hit it to their team, then that actually gives you quite a lot of information quite easily. But then the more nuanced information, like the game score, for example, if I said to someone who'd never heard of cricket that it's 58 for 2 in the second over of an ODI, it just is meaningless.
Yes.
So that kind of information, the same as pitch count would be for a lot of cricketers.
Yeah, exactly.
So that kind of more nuanced information was used a lot also by a higher skill performer, as was the sequencing information, which wasn't necessarily used as much as by a low skill performer. But then there's some things which you can see, and in cricket the fielders aren't allowed to move after they're in place before the bowler runs in.
Okay.
Which is what I was saying about the fact that there's a lot of information available before anything happens in each delivery. So less skilled people can tend to work out a bit around that quite easily, and then generally ignore the information that they just don't understand, or the more nuanced information. Whereas the skill performers were using a combination of everything, and then eventually updating it or adding in the visual information that they get later on.
Okay. Yeah, though that's really interesting. And I know you've also kind of looked at, one kind of idea I think you tested is the idea that there might be some load effects, like, so keeping all this information in mind and processing might be too much for a lesser skill, but you didn't really find results did you find, or did you, I should ask?
No, I didn't really.
Yeah.
Interestingly, this came from reading around like representative design, but then also having an understanding of some of the like education literature, which is very anti making things too complicated. So the cognitive load theory that I've worked with a bit is really out of education, and it says that you've got to have some free capacity to learn, because otherwise there's not enough free space to rebuild schema, and that's the kind of theoretical approach it takes. So then I'm reading about representative design and thinking this could be extremely difficult for a lower skilled performer. But generally what I found was that it was pretty easy for people to continue to execute the task with context added in. And even with some like secondary tasks, I found that it didn't cause much load at all. And generally from the data I've got about people kind of just like rating the kind of information they're using, and actually an EEG study since that I've done with a PhD student called Marie Simonet, who's from Switzerland, found really that the less skilled people would pretty much just ignore the information that they didn't understand. So that doesn't cause any load. But then the other information, like the field settings, is very easy to use. So the idea was I wanted to find out if adding these kind of scenarios into training would overload a beginner. But generally the answer was no. So then I'd suggest, we need to be including these scenarios in practice from a pretty early point for people to learn to use that information when they're playing.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think that's a great point, right? So you generally would believe they're just not using it. They're not sensitive to those trends. Yeah. I know something also you did. One of the nice things you can do with this kind of design is you can make the two types of information disagree with each other, right? You could set up a game situation where someone should bowl a long ball and then bowl a short one, right, and see what happens.
Exactly.
What kind of things do you find in there? Is part of the issue with lesser skill is they just kind of take the first thing and then stop paying attention to what the rest of the unfolding.
So one thing I started thinking was in a lot of my earlier studies, I was deliberately making everything match up to see if it enhanced the ability to or lowered the error of where they considered the ball to be going. And we found that like the skilled performers could do this with a blank screen, just showing them the field setting and the score without even showing them a bowler. They would start to move towards a more appropriate outcome point. But then obviously you have this issue of, well, what if all that information is wrong? The stuff that comes in early. And I was actually interested in more from the skilled people, because the skilled performers seem to be more reliant on it than a lesser skilled person who might not know what it means. And there's actually, we did a study where we looked at different occlusion points and basically found that the skilled people relied more on the context early on. So then I thought, well, if it's wrong, then it might affect skilled people more. And there's actually a phrase in cricket, bad balls get wickets. It's often said in a more expletive fashion. But generally, this idea that often, and even when you watch at a high level, and I had a chat with a few performance analyst people as well who've seen this come out in some international sport cricket data as well, that delivery that would be considered poor because it's too full or too short. So maybe a full toss, so you hit it without bouncing, would be the easiest ball to play in cricket. Or one that's really short would be the easiest ball to play because you have so much time after it's bounced. You actually often see people getting out to those kind of deliveries. So people score a lot of runs off them, but people get out more often.
Right.
So it's kind of like a high risk, high reward type approach, but no one would ever really do it on purpose because it doesn't make sense to do in the context of the game. But then regularly people get out to these. So I looked at this idea of the fact that it might be because the visual information that comes is so contrasting with what you expect based on the context. So if you have a highly skilled bowler, you'd expect them to be quite consistent, and bowling to your field where you have your teammates placed is the way that you prevent the batter from scoring runs. So if I have lots of fielders over there, I want to bowl the ball on that side to force the batter to hit it to them, right? So if I bowl on the other side, it's high risk and very easy for them to score against me. So what I looked at was basically just mismatching the information. So I'd give them the context that didn't match the delivery or some that did, and look at these early judgments that could be made by the players, and found that actually that incongruent context affected the skilled performers more. This was before the ball flight, because they were just relying on it more and using it more. Now, it might be that they were also therefore quicker at adapting to it afterwards because they're more skilled in their movements as well. But in terms of the judgments that happen up until the point of the first few milliseconds of ball flight, the mismatch in information was causing more of an issue for the skilled performers. Because they were relying a lot on the sequence and the score and the field setting and assuming that a skilled bowler would execute correctly. So then if I deliberately gave them a mistake, in a nutshell, from the bowler, where they bowled it a bad delivery, in a nutshell, they were very poor at predicting where they might go. That doesn't mean they wouldn't be able to hit them necessarily, but it means that, for me, it probably means that they would be moving slightly later if they aren't as able to use that early information. And that might be what causes the false shots, for example.
Yeah, the bad balls. So I think that's really interesting. So it's a bad ball because you're right. If the person hits it, they're going to hit to the side of the field with no fielders, right? So the pitch, so it's a bit different than like I keep relating it to baseball in my head, but where you do like a change up or a super slow pitch, you're not necessarily. There's a bit of that because bad fielders shift in baseball too, but that's really interesting. So it's not kind of that. It's just that the not expert, lesser skilled are not even using a lot of this stuff, so that the congruence doesn't enter into it for them, right?
Yeah, a lot of the time. A bit with the field setting where they kind of work that out a little bit, but certainly not to the same level that it would for the skill performers. But it might mean that when everything's aligned, they're at a serious disadvantage because everything happens later and they have to use that later available information from later parts of the ball flight, which would make it much harder to play the ball. But then it might be then that actually if everything is wrong beforehand, then actually using that later ball flight is an advantage. And it might be that, like some of the old goalkeeping studies, that later information is more reliable and actually might be useful to be using that, but there'll be some kind of last moment which might be a problem with the bad balls, where it especially a full toss, because that comes a lot quicker, the ball slows a lot when it bounces, could cause an issue if everything is incongruent and then you get a full toss. You could be in a very disadvantageous position if you'd been relying on that early information.
Yeah. No, and yeah, like I said, you certainly see it in other sports too. Like in baseball, there's one pitcher, Zach Greinke. Sometimes he throws 60-mile-an-hour pitches right down the middle. The batter just stand there, and you're like, because it has to be something that weren't expecting that pitch. So that's really interesting. So have you tried to kind of? I know I've tried to do this a bit myself, and I know people trying to put this all together, like how to batter. So do you think of it as kind of like a prediction that's kind of like an evolving prediction where you're making a rough guess based on, and then you just refine your prediction as you get more and more information?
Yeah, I'd pretty much see it that way with the data that I've had of it constantly evolving. So I wouldn't suggest that a batter sees the field and just decides at that point what type of response to execute. Although that does happen in cricket in what we call premeditated shots. For example, in cricket, you can hit the ball behind you. And in the modern day, players have started developing this scoop shot where they would ramp the ball over their own heads, over the wicketkeeper / backstop, which obviously would just be a foul ball in baseball. But in cricket, it's become quite an advantageous shot. But you can't do that fast enough reacting to the ball. So people premeditate if there's fielders, the fielders aren't there behind them. And they use it to manipulate and move people around. So then the other team are forced to move a fielder there, and then they will hit it somewhere else. So you do get that premeditated shot based on the field in cricket, but generally that's quite unusual and only happens in very specific type scenarios. But I would generally see it as a kind of you're lowering down the options of what might happen, but it's going to be a constant update, and then especially you're going to get more reliable information as it comes later. And to be honest, during the ball flight as well, you're going to still be updating. But it might be, for example, if I'm expecting a short ball, I'll have my weight a little bit more on my back foot to move backwards before the bowler even runs in, and then be updating that information as it comes in. So I might be in a great position if it is short, but still able to not get out if it is a full delivery. But I would see it, as a kind of, you're starting to narrow some probabilities, but it's evolving constantly.
Yeah, you're combining and refining, I guess. Yeah. Have people done the kind of motion tracking force plate kind of research to see if you do get kind of anticipatory weight shifts or movements based on information?
A bit, not so much in cricket. I did one study with some 2D kinematics looking at shot execution and found some differences based on field settings in timing and in displacement of the batter's front foot, which is one of the kind of key, the first shot you get taught in cricket would be called a forward defensive, which is a way that you can not lose your wicket, not get out. Which is obviously a big deal in cricket. If you get out, you might not be allowed to play for another 3 days until it's your turn again. So, but yeah, it's not been done so much. I know Robin Jackson's been doing a little bit on deception stuff in rugby with the force plate work as well, and it's something I want to do in cricket definitely as well, and get kind of back out there with some real bowlers and that kind of thing. It's just a case of getting it organised with all of that difficulty of doing it kind of in situ with a real bowler and a real batter. And we have a similar issue of bowlers not being allowed to bowl very often, especially at a higher level, as you would with baseball players and their pitch counts and stuff. So it is something I'd really like to look at. And it's something that you can definitely talk to batters about them doing, but haven't got that kind of evidence base down for the force plate type style thing yet, but that would be a really nice thing to do, definitely.
Yeah, it is. I think it's a bit trickier in cricket too, because they can move around so much. And
exactly,
in baseball, you just put it under their 2 feet and then you're good to go. But yeah, that's a tricky. So you mentioned in the one kind of, in terms of design kind of application, the suggestion of adding more of this information into lesser skilled batters right away instead of having them hit a kind of maneuver. Is there other kind of applications you're thinking of? Do you do anything on kind of video based training anticipation using this and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. that I would be really interested in getting into, I think I would need to first of all do a study looking at whether having this kind of information allows people to learn how to use it if it's just kind of there without it necessarily being explicitly taught to them. But I don't see anticipation training as being something that would be separate from normal training. It would just be, if I'm batting all the time in the nets, why don't I have these scenarios so I'm learning with them all of the time? So yeah, thinking about this and thinking about, for example, a golfer when they're a kid being on the 18th green and being like, oh, I've got this putt to win the Open, and that kind of scenario around it is a similar idea, not necessarily in anticipation in this sense, but it's something you see all the time. And so my kind of first step towards thinking about measuring context in training was to get a bunch of beginner golfers in a really simple task and give them different match play scenarios and just see if it affected the way that they did things, which it did. We measured quiet eye period and performance in just a really simple putting task, and found that even if you gave a complete novice a different scenario, they'd execute their shot differently.
Okay.
And that was kind of my first step into kind of a simple, if we give people these scenarios, is it going to change things from that kind of early level of training? So building on that, then I'd like to do some work looking at actually a more dynamic task, maybe in cricket batting, for example, where we have scenarios from an early point, training some new players in a nutshell, and see if they start to learn to use that information by having scenario-based training in a nutshell. So we'd often have it in nets when I'm coaching or playing, for example, that you'd put kind of cones around the net to represent where the fielders are, and your bowler would be given a scenario and the batter would be given a scenario, and they kind of play out these scenarios.
Okay.
And that's something that would be done maybe often kind of like at the end of sessions, or maybe if you're preparing for a specific type of match, because in cricket you have 3 different types of matches of different lengths, which involve different skill sets as well. But I'm interested in then seeing, can we teach people to use that earlier and be more efficient with using that information? Because so much of training in all these sports, golf as well, on the driving range, like so much of the early practice goes on without any kind of scenario of the important bits of the game, which will then influence, for example, anticipation, but also just your shot selection and decision making as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good idea. I think you can relate just intention, and like you need, like that's what I've observed a lot with when I've been lucky to work with really good athletes and baseball players. Even in the most simple practice, like batting practice, they have an intention of what they want to do in that. So they do almost. So you're talking almost like kind of giving a person a scenario. Like imagine you're on the 18th hole, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's a good underused, because it's such a low tech, like a lot of this.
Exactly.
Way it takes, to set up an anticipation experiment. There's lots out there, but it takes a while. Yeah, I think that's
I'd love to do stuff that's useful for the people I see at the park at the weekend with the All-Stars kids we have over here, which is like a English cricket thing for 4 to 6 year olds or something like that, where it's like there's a lot of hitting, but there's no reason you can't say, well, just imagine that you've got to score 3 runs off this ball and stuff. And it's just such a low tech, easy thing that looks like from some of the data that we've got and you've got so far, that actually becomes quite an important part of performing at a higher level. And from the data I've got around the cognitive load stuff suggests that it'd actually be pretty simple to put into play and wouldn't be too difficult for beginners as well.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think that's a really interesting angle. Kind of moving away from anticipation, I wanted to ask you the study you had come out late last year, I think was a really interesting one, looking at people using training golf with using their smartphone, right? I think to me, that's a really interesting question, because the technology for measuring stuff is just proliferating everywhere. Really expensive stuff teams have to stuff you can download. And the big question is, how do you use it and how it's going to affect you? I think we're missing that point. We're just developing things without asking how and when. So can you tell us a little bit about what your goal was with that study?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it for a while. If you go on like golf Instagram, it's full of angles and smash factors and degrees of wrist bend at the top of the backswing, and the takeaway looks like this. And I actually was at a driving range, and each bay had a little stand so you could put your smartphone behind you and video your own golf swing. And I always hated it for myself, because it's such a weird out of body thing to do for yourself, but also you have no idea what you're looking for and you can't see where the ball goes. So you're kind of missing the point for me a lot of the time with a lot of video analysis where you don't know what the outcome is. And actually, I think a lot of golf coaches now are moving towards this idea of using the ball flight and coming back to the swing. And if the ball flight looks good, then there's not much they need to do with the golf swing, which isn't necessarily traditionally what was happening. And actually, in my undergraduate project, which we never published, I did some work on a new app back then in like 2009, 10 or something like that, where you could compare yourself to a professional player in cricket. We were making, but they existed in golf too. And everyone I tested basically said, if they looked at this on their own, they would be desperate to have a coach because they're seeing so many things that don't look the same. But they have no idea what to do about them. And eventually I met Beth, who's the first author on this paper, Beth Yeoman, who was a master's student at the University of Chichester, also a really good golfer, and worked at Goodwood Golf Club, which was just down the road. Same place as the famous motor circuit for motorsports fans, but there's a nice golf club there at Goodwood too. And it's tough to do this kind of study, obviously, because we needed a month or more long training period where we're controlling people's training. So having someone who's a good player embedded with some good players was helpful too. And I mentioned my thoughts about the fact that videoing yourself especially might have a real kind of internal focus impact and a real kind of just potentially overwhelming people with information who don't necessarily know what they're looking for, even good players. But then also just forcing people to have an internal focus because you literally can't see where the ball goes. And I know there have been a bit of literature around how coaches use video analysis, but it's still not enough, to be honest, with the amount that it goes on, suggesting that a similar thing, that it kind of made coaches focus back towards these kind of internal technical points and not necessarily the outcome of the movement. So yeah, Beth and I, and then Phil Birch, who is also a golfer and a lecturer in psychology in Chichester, basically put together this project where we were trying to also get some more natural focus of attention data too, because decent golfers in the summer, they're spending a lot of time on the driving range on their own. No one's forcing them to focus on anything a lot of the time. They're normally coming up with their own practice. And golf seems to be a kind of culture where you spend most of your time on your own, and then you ring up a coach for an hour if you've got an issue that you want to cover, rather than it being this kind of long-term relationship. So players are spending a lot of time on their own with loads of access to technology with no idea necessarily what to do with it. So we wanted to get this kind of natural look at what people were doing and then see what the effect of the smartphone videoing was in a nutshell. And then, so we kind of designed a study with two groups, one which we're going to just practice on the range as they normally would, and one which would have a smartphone. And we wanted to not manipulate focus of attention at all. We just wanted to see what the smartphone did, and also look at some transfer, because so many of the studies in the lab are on putting, for example, one element of the game. So we took some Stableford scores before and afterwards. So that's basically a point score based on your actual score compared to your handicap, to see if what we are seeing on the range would actually transfer around to the course in a much more complex scenario as well.
Okay.
So in these two groups, we basically got them to practice a set amount and do a pre-test on a 116-yard shot. So like long enough, a lot more complex than a putting task, for example, but still quite a short shot in the context of the game. And pre-test on their Stableford scores, pre-test in this like driving range, more controlled task, a month of set practice with or without a smartphone, and then the same at the other end in a nutshell. And they diaried all their practice, and we took measures of their focus of attention during practice from their diaries.
Okay, that's right. 'Cause so in the video condition, are they just seeing a playback, just the raw video without any kind of analysis or So as you mentioned, you want to just control because if you start pointing out, circling your knee, you're going to direct attention internally.
Exactly. So they videoed themselves every 10 shots when they were practicing.
Okay.
And picked out whatever they wanted from the videos. Like they got no guidance on what to work on from the videos, because again, that's what we see people doing all the time, is videoing themselves and trying to work out something that's going to make them better. And from that, we saw them reporting a lot more internal focus from that group in their diaries about what they're working on in practice.
So they're doing the video once every 10. So you're not. Another problem I know in motor learning, we always talk about is frequency, right? Looking at it after every swing, but you try to kind of take that out of the
Yeah, we
equation?
didn't want we wanted them to every player to have the same number of times looking at their own swing, and we controlled how much they practiced as well. Basically, 2 buckets of 50 balls at the driving range a week, which was they're quite good players. Single finger handicaps average about 5, so like good club players. So it's kind of the amount they were practicing normally. But yeah, we didn't let them video every single swing, but so controlled for that as well. And they're all people who'd never used this technology before, which was not easy to find, to be honest.
Yeah, I bet in golf. It's golf's the worst and the best, I guess, depending on your viewpoint.
Yeah.
So in your results, there was an effect on the range shots, but not on the actual when they went and played around. Is that
correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was an interaction effect where the people who were just practicing without video improved their range scores a small amount pre to post. The people who had the video had more internal focus and lower range scores pre to post. So they decreased their range performance. But the 5 Stableford scores we took before and after were pretty much level, like no transfer onto the golf course.
Oh, that's interesting. So would you, I guess could be multiple interpretations, but would you think that maybe, is it like just because it's maybe a transient effect, or do you think there's possibility that this internal, it doesn't really, it's not as big of an issue when you get to actual play? I know you can't really tease that out in your study, but that's an interesting finding.
Yeah, it is. And one, it's just a wildly more complex environment out on the golf course to see that kind of effect play out in maybe over a very, very long period of time. If we were doing it, you might see it start to play out on the golf course. The other issue that I've discussed with other people in the past, and golf coaches too, is there's some really high level players who are extremely technical, internal focus, working on body angles on the driving range, but have none of that going on when they actually compete. And being that kind of engaged in practice might actually be a positive thing for them, depending on individual player preferences. I'm thinking of some specific major champions who I've spoken to, their coaches, and they just seem to have this ability to switch. And I was actually having a conversation this morning about the difference between being aware of your movements and being in conscious control of your movements, which are different things as well.
Yep. I remember getting into is it monitoring or control, right? Or
Exactly.
where, it's a big difference. And which of those? So, that's a great question.
I think, we were just really keen to not force people into a certain type of attention and see what happens actually out on the golf course. And also with people who are already skilled players. So a month of practice might not be a lot for someone who's a 5 handicapper, but it's what we could get out of this study. And it was interesting to see the effects of the smartphone on what they were working on the range, and the fact that did have some effect on their kind of more controlled performance. But then when they're out competing, we didn't see anything.
Yeah, no, that's like I said, I think that's really interesting. So I guess, the most direct implication from this would be don't video yourself when you're practicing. But kind of what are your thoughts about, is there a good way to use this for like the recreational player? And at the same time, what more do we need to do to study? Like, I think there's a million more research questions I'm sure you have about it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people love data and looking at their own swing, and I often think that people are forced into aesthetic changes, especially in golf. There's a lot of, I want my swing to look a certain way, not I want the ball to go in a certain direction necessarily. I don't think it's never used this kind of technology, but I think you need to be using it for a reason. So maybe you're working on with a coach that you're trying to get into a certain position, or you're trying to hit the ball higher, for example. And if there's a cue you can pick out from your video, maybe one that shows that you're maybe making progress in that, then that might be useful. But just videoing something and seeing what it looks like and picking something to work on. Lots of our players, even good ones, were picking 5 things a day to out from their videos, which isn't going to be particularly useful.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think, and that connects, I think you can connect that with your context ideas, like with, it's deliberate practice intent. You need to have a plan. Just randomly fishing information for something to work on is dangerous in sport.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
But yeah, I think it can be useful if you're using it in the right way, having a plan. And actually, what I've found from some other chats I've had is people want to talk to a coach more when they've been able to do it on their own. And it's almost like, oh, if I have this video, maybe I'll never need a coach again. And then you look at your golf swing or your batting stance once and you're like, oh, blimey, I need to go and talk to someone about how to deal with this in some ways. But the main thing that my issue with it is that you just can't see where the ball goes.
Yeah, you're right. You got to link it to performance. Yeah. I think you could almost think of it like a flipped classroom kind of.
Yeah.
Like people doing their own stuff, homework on their own, and come to a coach more prepared. Because probably measuring things is not the best use of a coach's time, right? When you can just do it on your own. Yeah.
I've been talking about doing similar stuff with TrackMan, ball flight trackers, and that kind of thing, and what it should be used for as well. And interestingly, like looking at someone like Dustin Johnson, who just takes the yardages and that's it. It's knowing what you want it for, I think, is important.
Yeah. No, I think that's really, really interesting line of work. And so I guess the last question I have for you is, kind of what do you have going on now and planned for research wise? Yeah,
it's a great question. I've got a few things. I suffer from a broad range of interests, I would say. Where
nothing wrong with that.
I'm interested in a lot of different things, so I have some work going on with blind football where I'm doing some classification work, which I'm really enjoying with Dave Mann as well and the IPC classification center there, which is a really interesting applied but also super fundamental question of what level of vision do you need to perform in this sport? And it's incredibly complicated to come up with an answer to that question, especially when people will have lots of different types of impairments and things. So I'm doing some work on that, and we're supposed to be doing some simulation work, which has been COVID delayed, but I'm going to try and see that through. And we're working with IBSA, the International Blind Sports Federation, to produce some new rules for some more evidence base for their classification system of different levels of impairment being in different classes for blind football, which I'm really, really enjoying doing that. And it goes kind of all the way back to the vision stuff that I kind of started out being interested in as well. But yeah, really complex but fundamental question, but with really applied implications, which is kind of like the dream scenario, I guess. So I'm still working on the context side of things as well, a bit with Cole Murphy and Dave Broadbent, who have been doing kind of similar things to looking at different types of information, because I've had some different findings in other people, and we think it's down to the fact that, saying they go 70% that way and 30% that way is a very different type of information than the field setting and the score, for example, which you have to have a bit more understanding to actually use. So we're doing a bit on the types of information that might be useful in that direction. And one other thing that I really have started working on a bit is the English and Wales Cricket Board have just given out about just under 50 new professional contracts for female players and started 8 new regions where they'll have developmental pathways for female professional cricketers. And I know, reading some of Joe Baker's recent reviews, there's just no information for these coaches and developers and the people in charge of designing these environments on the nuances of the female athlete talent development pathway.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'm really keen, and I'm going to be working a bit with cricket to try and just get some information. Like, there was a study out recently that showed, for example, the relative age effect doesn't seem to exist in some of the female environments compared to male ones, and the pathways are going to look very different. I think potentially more multi-sport people, more late transfers in women's cricket, for example. So that's an area I'm interested in too. So kind of blind football, I'm still doing the context work and still interested in talent ID and development, especially kind of helping the evidence base develop on the women's professional sports, which are quite new in cricket especially. And then I also have some PhD students working on a variety of things too. So Chris Vine, who's looking at interactions between cognitive performance and physical exertion in a military context. And he's trying to design some more realistic tasks that literature's often used, some really kind of basic cognitive tasks. And he's trying to design some more realistic tasks to look at military specific cognitive performance. And then a couple motor learning PhD students. Some people will hate this, but some people will love it. One of them is looking at autonomy, motivation, and cognitive load in motor learning.
Okay.
He's really interested, martial arts coach, and really interested in that side of things. And then Adele Quinn, my other PhD student, is dance science lecturer, and she's really interested in applying the constraints approach to teaching dance, which
Cool.
is very traditionally in the other direction. So I've got a bit going in all directions, I would say, but I think that really sometimes I berate myself that I need to have a bit more focus, but then I also think, like I'm someone who is really interested in everything, and I think there's actually a real place in science in general for more broad work and understanding across different areas.
Yeah, no, I really like it, Ollie. Yeah, I've often said to myself, I should have just, in one way is it would be good to have your name associated with one thing. Like, you're the anticipation guy. But on the other hand, that's kind of boring. I decided in my career, I'm going to move away. But also, I really love the mix of applied and basic. That's a real sweet spot when you can do that well. Where you can, like you said, the Paralympic stuff is really, really right. That's really you're addressing an important question they want to know and for setting the standards, but also it has tons of basic theoretical implications, and I really like that when you can mix those two together.
Yeah, me too. And I'm trying to strike that balance as well. I love doing good science, but I also love sitting down with coaches and talking about things that are relevant to them. And I think there's a real, like you say, a nice sweet spot in between the two, and especially when you can find problems which hit both of them at the same time, I think is great.
Yeah. And I think you're also like pushing like a few times you mentioned pushing some of the lab stuff we recognize is limited, like the golf studies with only putting and right,
Exactly.
it needs to be done, right? But we need to keep pushing, making sure we're getting closer to the real thing.
Yeah, and I think it took me a while to, it's harder to do that, to do those studies.
Yeah.
And my first PhD study, kind of 4-condition context and anxiety study with a real bowler with only 12 participants, it took me almost a year to actually get that done, to collect data for that, like when I'm working on it almost full time, but just because of the difficulties. So there's huge challenges in taking things out there into the real world in terms of practicality, but definitely something that I've become more and more keen on doing, and also just working on the questions that people are in those fields are interested in knowing about.
Yeah. I guess I have another question. I said it was a lot, but do you think part of it is like changing the way we do the methods kind of now? Like, because your golf example is a great one. Like, I think as you recognize, the chance of you finding that thing, the effect you found on the driving range in a round of golf is pretty much because it's going to be buried in the a round of golf is so variable. Yeah. The chance of finding some small effect is pretty much none. Like it's going to be buried even if it's there. So do you think we have to change kind of the way, maybe more individuals, case studies?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of case study type literature as well, and even just some more advanced analysis in terms of looking at individual effects within a group, for example. Even just starting with little things like plot all your data points and see what individuals are doing, but I do think there is potentially in that study, for example, if I was to do it again, I would try and get the players to do more in-depth statistical recording. So we could have seen if there's any effect on their approach shots from inside 100 yards, for example. But again, it's just the challenge where those Stableford scores are easy to access if you can just go on the computer and find out the competition scores for everyone before and after you're in a set time period. But getting a participant to engage in you limiting their practice for a month and then getting them to record all of their statistics for 5 rounds for a month before and after when you have no funding is not something that's going to be particularly easy to do. But if you're working with an organization, for example, you can work with your performance analysts and look at those kind of individual changes at more kind of subtle levels in actual performance scenarios. And that's something that I've been talking and trying to get going in the cricket context work, is saying there's all these people recording all this information about every professional match. Can you start recording where the fielders are? So we can see if it has any effect, because that's not something that's actually been done in cricket. It's just been, where did the ball bounce, who was bowling and who was batting, and what happened. And all that information around it's not actually been getting recorded in performance analysis in cricket, for example. So there is ways to tease it out, I think, but the methods are also going to be an issue. And there's definitely space for case studies, qualitative work as well. Read a good study recently that interviewed some hockey goalkeepers about anticipation and what they do in training versus what they actually use in games. So yeah, I think so.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Well, this was really great, Ollie. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
No worries. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Ollie. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at Shakeawaits. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Gone straight away.